Howdy again everyone. A little while ago I tested out a new autofocus Viltrox lens on my Sony camera, their nice little 24mm f1.4. Its build quality was very nice, its image quality good enough, and its value for money great. Well, now it's arrived for Canon's EOS M cameras, nicely adding to your list of options for lower budget lenses on that system. So I'm going to do a brief overview of how it performs on a Canon EOS M system, paying particular attention to its sharpness on a higher than usual resolution aps-c camera. Yes, I'll be testing it on my EOS M6 Mark II with its 32.5 megapixel sensor. If you want to see the original review, where I tested it on a Sony camera with a 24 megapixel sensor, then take a look in the description below. And that review goes into a bit more detail than this overview will do. You'll get a slightly fuller picture from my original video. The Canon EOS M version of this lens is slightly less expensive than the Fuji and Sony versions, interestingly, being $300 or about £270 in the UK, making it potentially fantastic value for money for an autofocus lens with such a bright maximum aperture. I'd like to thank Viltrox for sending me a copy of this lens for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. At the time of writing, the new Canon version of this lens has the same metallic build quality of the Fuji and Sony versions, but comes in silver. I'm never totally sure how to feel about silver coloured lenses and how they look, but actually on my EOS M6 Mark II it suits the silver top and bottom plates of the camera quite nicely. According to Viltrox, a black version of the lens should come eventually. The lens is still not weather sealed, but you do get a USB port embedded in the mount for firmware updates in the future, and Viltrox tend to be quite good at updating their lenses periodically. On one of Canon's EOS M system cameras, the autofocus motor works quite quickly, but it does take a tiny extra moment to solidly lock onto your subject before taking your picture. Still, it worked accurately, which is the main thing for me. The focus ring responds quite well to being turned, although it works in steps that could perhaps be a tiny bit more precise. In common with the Fuji and Sony versions of the lens, the aperture ring still turns smoothly. When you're shooting video and you turn that aperture ring, you actually get a smooth aperture changing response, although it jumps a little between f1.4 and f2. You get a nice silver hood to go with the lens on this Canon version. It retains its 52mm filter thread size and it still does not have image stabilization, but on a whole it works very nicely, and Viltrox seem to have done a good job in putting together this Canon implementation. So let's move on and look at image quality. As I already mentioned, I'm mounting it onto a Canon EOS M6 Mark II here, which has a 32.5 megapixel sensor, one of the most brutally demanding I've ever used. At f1.4 in the middle of the image, the lens is capturing a good amount of detail, but we also see a lot of purple fringing on contrasting edges. As you can see here, the corner image quality is quite dark and murky, although some details are still being captured here too. If you turn on in-camera corrections in your Canon camera, no difference is made to the image quality. Let's stop down to f2. There's a lot more brightness in your corners now, but nothing else has really changed. However, image quality back in the middle looks a lot more punchy, and a lot of the purple fringing has gone now. Stop down to f2.8 and that purple fringing goes away, leaving behind some reasonably sharp image quality there. The corners are looking a little sharper and brighter again now too, which is a nice improvement. Stop down to f4 for another boost to sharpness in the corners, leaving them looking very good, and the middle of the image looks a little sharper again. Finally, at f5.6, we see razor sharp picture quality in the middle of your image frame, and the corners are looking pretty great too. If you stop down as far as f11 or f16, the picture begins to get a lot softer due to the effect of diffraction. So overall, on a camera sensor as incredibly demanding as this one, and considering the lens's low price, its image quality is pretty acceptable. Sharpness at its widest apertures is quite usable, and the more you stop down, the sharper it gets. When it comes to distortion and vignetting, it's the same story as on the Sony version of the lens. We see a bit of barrel distortion here, and very dark vignetting in the corners at f1.4. Here's f2 and f2.8, but it's only really at f4 that the strong vignetting is mostly cleared up. On the higher resolution Canon sensor, the close-up image quality looks pretty soft at f1.4, f2, f2.8 and f4 get progressively sharper. The work against bright lights and the quality of the lens's bokeh are both the same as on the Fuji and Sony versions of the lens. Bright lights show a fair bit of flaring, and the bokeh is averagely soft, getting a bit busy with more difficult backgrounds. Here are some higher resolution pictures to show longitudinal chromatic aberration. As you can see, it's very strong at f1.4, displaying bright blue and magenta hints to bokeh highlights. As you stop down to f2, f2.8 and f4, it improves and eventually goes away. Overall, well, the image quality of this lens is not perfect, but it's definitely quite usable, even on a 32.5 megapixel camera, and especially considering its very low price. It may not be incredibly sharp, but for many people, just getting an autofocus 23mm f1.4 lens for under $300 is a bit of a dream come true, because it'll be just so useful on your camera. There's nothing directly comparable to this lens already on the Canon system. With autofocus and such a bright maximum aperture, the closest is probably Canon's own 22mm f2 STM lens, which is very nice and a bit sharper, but only lets in half the amount of light. The Viltrox lens will get you much more noticeably out of focus backgrounds than the smaller Canon Pancake lens. There are a number of competing manual focus lens options out there, but really, Viltrox are carving out a bit of a niche with this optic on the Canon EOS M system. Considering the lens is very good value for money, it has to come recommended.